Hi, and welcome to Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. I'm very excited to do this very special stream on May Day to talk about game design, and social movements. I am personally known in wargame circles for my radical positions, such as slavery is actually bad, women are human beings, war crimes are actually crimes, and probably we shouldn't do genocide, which is pretty far off, and I'm really sorry for that. I hope it won't offend too many people. But basically, the idea is to talk about that dynamic today of how can game integrate within wider social movements, how they can participate in it, or actually help promoting them in a different way. And I regrouped a panel to discuss this today. And I'm pretty happy with this panel, with one exception. We were supposed to have with us Matilda Simonsson, the designer of Turncoats and Pax Penning, but also the upcoming game with Luke Evison, Hellraisers, about miner strikes in the US. Unfortunately, she's sick, so we won't be able to have her. So it's going to be only boys, sadly, today, but we'll do fine. And I think it's okay. And Matilda will be back on the show anyway. She's almost a regular guest at this point. But yeah, I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I can see that Brian Train is actually in the chat. Very nice to have you here with us, Brian Train. Actually, it's funny because I met Brian for the first time as I met you, Richard, during a Class Wargame event last summer in London, where we were playing his urban warfare game, Civil Power. So that's really cool to have him here with us. And I can see that Olivier is here. We have Molotov Kokatiel, Nicholas. So that's really, really cool. Thanks all for being here. Just a quick reminder, if you like what we do here, please remember to subscribe and support the show by donating on Ko-fi, and you will join our awesome Discord server. That is very kind and very nice. Anyway, I'm very happy to have all of you. So we have Richard Barbrook, Alex Knight, Joe Dewhurst, and Yoni Goldstein. And what I would ask from each of you is probably to give a quick introduction of yourself and maybe tell us, when did you radicalize? And we'll start with you, Richard Barbrook.
Right, I'm involved with Class Wargames, so we've been going since 2007. So it was we discovered that Guy Debord made a game, Le Jeu de la Guerre, and normally you think when lefties invent games, this was quite some time ago before the present company. I met the present company. Usually we always thought of things like Bertel Ollman's Class Struggle, which is, he wrote a great book on dialectics, but it was a terrible game, appalling game. So we started playing this game. I had some old toy soldiers, Ottomans versus Habsburgs, or very appropriately Muslims versus Christians, as it was just in the War of Terror period. And we started playing the game and realized it was actually really good. And then we made a big version of it, a 2.5 size version, and started playing it collectively. He originally wanted to have a sort of one-on-one game that you would play in proletarian bars and bohemian cafes. And so, but we did it. So what we did is have a sort of little show where we made a film, which is a half an hour, which you can get on our website. And then we talk a bit about the game, and then we'd split up the audience into 2 teams and get them to play it. And that's, just sort of the best way to learn about Guy Debord's game, which he said it was his greatest work, was to actually play it. And we toured it all over the place. Including in the Hermitage with Voyner, who later became, some of whom became Pussy Riot, and the V&A and round Brazil. So, and then we started playing other games. We did, and we've made games. I mean, the most famous thing we did was the 2017 Labour Party campaign for general election, where we made CorbynRun, this app game, which got 1,400,000 impressions. So, it went viral, as they said.
Oh, yeah, as the young people say. But Richard, when did you get into politics?
Well, I think I've always been into politics, as my father was right-wing Labour. He was a running dog of American imperialism.
So isn't right-wing Labour just Labour?
No, there's we had Jeremy for a few years as leader, so that's not true. The Second International was a revolutionary Marxist organisation at one point in its history. So I always grew up with politics, but I think I sort of I guess it was, there's two things that turned me to the left. The first was just growing up, and I was the Sex Pistols generation, punk rock generation, and I discovered Guy Debord at an impressionable age. You know, I read the Society of Spectacle and thought it was the answer to everything, and then from on there it was a sort of, you know, council communism and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and all the rest of it. So that's one sort of intellectual tradition. But the other thing, which I think is interesting, talking about gaming, is when I was at school, we used to play with Airfix toy soldiers and tanks.
Oh yeah.
And we did the Eastern Front. Now, during the Cold War, we were taught by American historians that the Germans were the goodies with a bad leader, but the Russians were baddies with bad leader. And so all my little friends wanted to be the Nazis. And so I ended up saying, okay, I'll be the Soviets. Partly because my grandmother, who used to say that her husband only got back from the Second World War because the Red Army had got rid of most of the Wehrmacht before he landed in D-Day. And so I collected a large group of T-34 tanks and the rest of it you can get from, JS-1s, that's right. And then I started reading these histories, and it took me about 18 months to realize what they were doing, that actually these histories in the English were basically giving us, you know, Guderian and von Manstein's view. And you know, it's and then that sort of made me very sympathetic towards the Soviets because I was playing the Soviets. And the other thing is they won. I mean, that's the other thing. You know, we're talking about history. I mean, there's been this whole rewriting, certainly since 1991 as well, about the Second World War. And, you know, they're pulling down the memorials to the people who liberated Europe from fascism. Oh, and now we know and now, of course, they're supporting fascism in various places in Eastern Europe. So this is I think, an interesting about how gaming a particular piece of history. We're just history nerds, you know.
Yeah.
You start to actually understand it more, and then you start to realize actually the history that you're being taught. I was taught at GCSE was basically a lie, essentially.
So I think you're the first person that I've met that got radicalized by plastic soldiers. So that's so that's pretty cool. And maybe just to build upon what you said, for people who are not familiar with the show, you talked about Guy Debord's Jeu de la Guerre. And if you want to watch after that, there are two videos specifically on Le Jeu de la Guerre on the channel, one about the history and one where I'm actually playing a game. So we go through Le Jeu de la Guerre and you can see how it is being played. And then regarding the rewriting of history and the evolution of historiography on the East Front, we have a video specifically on When Titans Clash that is looking specifically to this book and how... by David Glantz, that actually re-explores and reanalyzes, actually based on the Soviet archives that were made open in the 90s, how actually the historiography of the East Front evolved and how we have a better picture of what was the Red Army back then.
They had better soldiers, better weapons, and better generals, and
really good tactics. Yeah, exactly. And you, Alex, so how did you become radicalized, and what's the connection with gaming, and who you are? Yes.
Well, I'm a board game designer. You might recognize my T-shirt. My first game, Land and Freedom, came out last year about the Spanish Civil War. I have other games about radical historical topics, like a game about the Russian Civil War called Hammer and Sickle. I have a game about John Brown and the radical abolitionist movement of the 1850s and the raid on Harper's Ferry. And yeah, I'm just very interested in creating games that hopefully can inspire people to have, visions of a different, better world, and maybe give them some ideas, some tools for how we can actually do that, or at least some inspiration for how people did that in the past. And as for the radicalizing question, for me, it goes back to, we see right now all the occupations that are happening on campuses across probably the world, but definitely in the U.S. here. So it was when I was in college, and the Iraq War was the build up to that was coming along through President Bush and everything, and just experiencing the similar to what Richard was saying in terms of the lies that the government was trying to connect 9/11 to this invasion of Iraq, which of course had nothing to do with 9/11. So I got very involved in the anti-war movement and the student environmental movement, and then Occupy Wall Street and anti-student debt campaigns and so forth. And all that organizing history experience has kind of informed my game design projects.
It's really interesting because I think the first march I went on was also against the Iraq War. I think it was the first time that I became politically active. It's funny that on two different sides of the ocean we had the same triggers. Probably a generational thing. And you, Yoni. So who are you, Yoni? It's the first time on the on the channel, but it's not the last time. You're going to be back. And what led you to politics?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Yoni. I'm here in Chicago, the official birthplace of the International Workers' Day.
Yes,
commemorating the 1886 Haymarket Affair. I'm a filmmaker, cinematographer, artist. I'm also the designer of Chicago 68 and with Joe and my brother Renan, as well as an upcoming game about the Luddite revolt with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. I don't know. I don't know when I was radicalized. But I could say that like when I was like 13, 14, maybe, I went to, my parents sent me to like a youth socialist sort of Bundist sleepover camp. And we would read Vietnam era war poetry and play Frisbee and,
Sounds
hang
awesome.
out, and I was just like a very inquisitive kid. And then just like Alex, like early aughts, in college, I joined like the anti-war movement. I do a fair amount of labor organizing and work around immigration, refugee rights, also clean water. Because, I was in the Great Lakes state of Michigan at the time. So that's that's a little bit of my past. For me, I feel like, the game space is, like actually existing socialism. For me, I'm looking at, even like the most sort of like economic sort of capitalist themed games all have sort of like this common kind of like frame that they're working in which there's, equality and, like heavy regulated economies and autonomy and even means of like ownership of means of production. So I was radicalized when I was 14 and I continue to be radicalized with like every game that I play.
Nice. Thanks for sharing, Yoni. And finally, last but not least, Joe Dewhurst. So, Joe, what led you into politics?
Well, first I need to introduce myself. I'm actually the host of this podcast. I'm less well known for my game development and game design work. So I designed some games, including Pure Land, about peasant revolts in Japan, and I developed Fred's games, Yoni's games, Alex's games, any game on a cool topic that I can find, pretty much, and someone left cool topics maybe. How did I get radicalized? So I have a somewhat similar origin story to Yoni, although less Bundist. But I had recently left-wing parents, and then when I was younger, I joined a youth group in the UK, which is a kind of like a hippie or socialist scouts called the Woodcraft Folk. And I think in quite a gentle way, a lot of the older people and the leaders, the kind of adult leaders there, had a big influence on me. So we would sing campfire songs about the diggers, about other kind of social movements. And then I just got interested in these things and learned a lot more about them, and that also just generated a very kind of cooperative attitude in me, I would say. And yeah, being there, I think just had a big influence on me in lots of quite subtle ways. And then as a teenager, I got more into these things. Slightly too late for the Iraq War stuff, although kind of on the edge of that. And then at university, I got into lots of student activism and things, as everyone does. And then up to this day, I'm still involved in some local things, mostly around housing and immigration as well. So similar to Yoni in some ways. Yep. And that's where I'm at. Yep.
Great. But thanks all for sharing and providing this context. I think the first question that I will have for each of you, and once again, as I told you in the introduction, I have a few guided questions, but I really want just to start conversation and then you can just reply to each other and we can build from there. But I think the first question that I was wondering about is, which game actually triggered in you the thought that politics can be seriously covered by this very weird medium, which is a board game, which is pretty unusual. I mean, if you look at militant spaces, at least the one that I'm in, I know that the first time that I went to the Belgian Workers' Party Université d'été and showed my game about the Paris Commune, like, it was a big shock and a big surprise that we could actually do board games that could talk about our history, our struggles, and talk about all this in a serious manner, in a way. So it's not something that is definitely in our spaces. So when was the trigger for you that you looked at games and just thought to yourself, well, there is actually here a medium that I can exploit and that I can use to actually say something about social movements? And we'll talk after about what they can do, but just when was the trigger that you realized it was a powerful medium to talk about those things? And I guess we can start with you, Alex.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I don't. So when I was a kid, my family played board games, but none of them were, they were just the traditional Monopoly, Scrabble, all that kind of stuff. Later on, I played the very comical class struggle game with Marx arm wrestling a capitalist on the cover, which is really a really old, kind of boring game, but a fun experience. So to me, it wasn't a game that really made that happen. I just had an intuitive desire to make games, and it was really out of the Occupy Wall Street movement that a friend and I just started fooling around with, could we make a game out of this experience of having all these different sort of factions, some radical, some reformist, that are all in the same space trying to turn this occupation into something. And the mechanisms that I knew at that point was basically a game like Puerto Rico, which we had been playing at the time, because it had that opportunity for someone to take an action and for other people to decide if they wanted to join that same action or not. So that became the kind of basis of my first prototype design out of an Occupy Wall Street game. But really, it was just because I was trying to find a way to capture this idea of the fragile alliance, which you can see in several of my games, like Land and Freedom, for example, that we're all broadly part of a coalition that's working against something, but we also have different agendas that we're having to balance, how much we want to work together versus how much we want to fight each other. So oddly, I guess my answer is Puerto Rico, but it's not because of anything political about that particular game, although I know that there is obviously the Puerto Rico 1898 game, which is kind of trying to, bring that game up to the 21st century in terms of its representations and stuff, but that's kind of a different topic.
Yeah, it's really interesting to have started with Puerto Rico. Definitely, that's an interesting choice. But what you were saying about different faction having an overall same goal but different sub-objective is something that we can definitely see in Land and Freedom, which is a competitive cooperative game. How did this reflection on Occupy actually inform the work that you did on Land and Freedom?
Like I said, it was rooted in that organizing experience, because obviously in Occupy Wall Street, you had anarchists, you had Marxist-Leninists, you had liberals, you had just a wide group of occupiers that didn't have any previous politicization, that were just showing up and wanting to get involved and not having a clear direction for what that meant. You also had right-wing libertarians involved, so obviously, everyone was broadly on some minimal level against Wall Street, however they define that. But everyone had there were very clear divisions within that made it difficult to remain any kind of united force. And so the Spanish Civil War, we could draw a direct parallel, obviously, with how that broke down. And it was just a natural place for me to make my first game about that topic, because that experience of the fragile alliance was what I really wanted to capture.
Yeah, that's great, and I think the game depicts it very, very well. I just want to give a small shout out here to Ender, who managed to unionize at his work. So well done on that. It is definitely one of the most important things that you can do. I think unionizing is one of the key ways of fighting for your rights as workers. So I think it's really, really awesome that you managed to do this. And I hope that people in the chat might get inspired. So yeah, that's very cool. And you, Richard, when did you realize that games could be a device to talk about politics and potentially expand your own activism?
Well, I think back to university days when we did all-night sessions of playing Kingmaker, which is
nice.
Having my first year before I switched into social and political science, as it was laughingly called, I did history for a year, and I did medieval history. So it was really interesting. You could play a game and sort of grasp part of the Wars of the Roses. And I think Andrew McNeil, who I used to know when I was just before I went to university, and I think he really got that whole thing that actually it's not the king who's the main person, it's the barons. So I thought that was a really good game, and I played board games on and off, but it was mainly because I wrote a book called Imagining Future, which is sort of anti-hero of it is Marshall McLuhan, and I wanted to write a book on Guy Debord, and I've got a whole shelf of books over here on Guy Debord, where they, as Debord himself says, they have a corpse in their mouth. They treat it as an academic subject. And I was trying to think about how do you write about situationism in a way that he doesn't sort of make it into something dead. And just by accident, we discovered in the back of the Len Bracken biography these rules for his game. And then obviously reading the book he did with Alice Becker Ho. And it was doing these sort of public events, I suppose, that we realised how useful board gaming is. And it's interesting that so there's this sort of conference of academic Marxists called historical materialism, and I remember they had one in London where they had a whole strand on the situation. And so I wrote to them saying, well, look, you're doing situation. Why don't we put on the game? Right, he said it was his most important, achievement, and they wrote us back this incredibly snotty reply about, oh no, we can't have that. We can't actually play situationism. And it was a general reaction when I did the book. I got people saying, why you want to write a book about a board game? And I think it's interesting how things have changed, and I think it's a lot to do with having people who've grown up playing video games, who then are then working all day on a computer screen, and it's created this whole space of adult board gamers. I have a 10-year-old son and we play board games, but he's among his peer groups. A lot of them just play video games all the time, and I think that's interesting, and that's where we started to make other games. We started doing these role-playing exercises for the World Transformed. We did one about based on a book that Chris Mullin did called A Very British Coup. And then the next year we did one about a local government having to deal with a housing redevelopment. And that went really well, A Taste of Power. And so we did those sorts of games, sort of role-playing exercise games. Then we did the CorbynRun app game, which was extraordinarily successful. And we've done other things like Matrix games. And we're working on we work on various projects. So it just seems that it's a really good way of having a sort of social space where, as Alex says, you can get very different political viewpoints and they can play a game. And one of the key things we learned from Debord, which is, if you want to beat Bonaparte, you have to play Bonaparte. When we did this one in the 2019 Labour conference at the World Transformed, we actually got the sort of hard left people to play the property developers or the Blairites. And then get the more reformists to play the hard left, and you get people to play different roles. And we did one which was a sort of election game about making a coalition, and this friend of ours, Dan Judelson, was playing the Tories. And he was scarily good. And we said, we're glad that, for some people from school who turned into Tory MPs, you're on our side, because he made us brilliant Tory leader. So it's that interesting that people can learn about, often the best, as I said, what the good thing about games is a way of exploring these other sides. Yeah. And you've got to allow people to do that. And I like what Alex said about that different, something we've been trying to do is the cooperative and competitive together. And I think that's a really tricky thing to do. We're doing a thing in a couple of months. We're doing these last Friday struggle sessions, which is this month we're doing a guest of Hot Robin Hood, aren't we? Yeah. But the one after, we're going to do, it's the 25th anniversary of the Carnival Against Capital in London. And we want to do Fluffies versus Spikies, or Fluffies and Spikies, not really. Yeah. And again, try and get to people to think about something which is sort of disappeared among political tactics. But on the other hand, trying to get people to play opposites,
Yeah, that's really good. That's a really interesting point.
Right.
Yeah. And I think we'll come back to Matrix game afterwards, because Ian in the chat has asked a really good question that I'm keeping for later.
I'm a really big fan of Matrix games.
I would bring it back later, because I would really like for you to answer to this one specifically. But now I'll go back to you, Joe. So when did you realize that games were potentially a way to talk about politics in a meaningful way?
That's a good question. I mean, like I've been playing games for all my life, as I'm sure everyone here has. But I suppose it's probably actually when I discovered the Coin series by Volker Rünke, counterinsurgency series, and there's lots of things you can say about the politics of that series. But what it showed me is you can have these serious studies of social movements and political movements, and how these things affect war, and it doesn't just need to be about the kinetic aspects of war. So that's what got me thinking about this, and then like many other young minds, I was therefore corrupted and spun off thinking about how to adapt the system for all kinds of ill-fitting other situations. And then that's also how I met you, Fred. And I think your first game, Red Flag Over Paris, made me realize even more than just that you can have games on interesting political topics, that you could have games on with the politics that I might want to show people and tell people about, and that got me thinking about how to other kinds of social movements and other kinds of radical events into games. That's probably how I got into that kind of frame of mind, I'd say. Yep.
Okay, and for you, Yoni, what was the trigger?
So I suppose I'm kind of a latecomer. I think to, at least here in the US, to get into games, to get into board games, means to have like a rooted place and rooted community, and that took some time. And so probably, I mean, so if I think back, we're probably talking about sort of just early, pre-COVID and then into lockdown, sort of when I got interested in these games. And it was really through a lot of Cole Wehrle designs. His historical games, absolutely, but also Root, and thinking through these different ways of thinking about games, not necessarily as like historical models, but as like dialectical spaces in which you have these different vectors and different trajectories, and each one has a corollary, maybe like an ideological corollary or like historical corollary. But it's really about their interactions in a shared space that creates a kind of like, sort of philosophical, political ideas that I was interested in. And so for me, it was, being in Chicago in the doldrums of lockdown, and looking at different historical games and finding Jim Dunnigan's Chicago, and thinking through the possibilities of historical treatises and ideas of like expressed through game design, and also it being May 2020 and the George Floyd protests in Chicago, and seeing those same sort of like powder blue helmets that the police were wearing in 1968, beating up demonstrators, and seeing them wear the same helmets in Chicago in 2020. That sort of like it's got me thinking like, okay, there are sort of like links and connections that we could make through games, about history, about the present time, and like talking about and thinking through like the idea of like, like what is a social movement? What unites these different factions? How do you represent that? How do you express the tensions between factions? How does a collective agency like emerge out of that? So I'll stop there for now. But that's sort of what got me going.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it got me thinking. How do you feel like? All good, Yoni. Yeah. How do you feel that games generally are perceived within political spaces that you're taking part in? I'm just curious about, because I'm thinking, for example, Richard, I think the last Class Wargame event I went, there was someone from the Labour Party that was here watching what we were doing, and we were playing Red Flag Over Paris. We were playing the censorship variant, just to say. People are asking. And she seemed a bit confused about the relevance of this. But on the other hand, you've also animated some pretty advanced matrix game for the party. So how do you feel that games are perceived right now? Did it evolve over the last few years, and how do you think it's going to evolve in the future?
Well, we also had some people from the Chicago Space Platypus group came along, but that was quite interesting in itself. We just did a Clone Wars game with 6mm figurines, for which we managed to find a quote from Chris Coutrone to justify lefties play a game based on Donald Featherston's War Games. I think one of the things we learned, going back to what Yoni said, is actually the board game is a social space. And there's one thing about having, I think this is one of the appeals for grown-ups for actually going, there's been this huge revival of board games. I mean, amazing, especially considering when we started in 2007, as I said, we had sort of amazement actually from people. What they were just very odd. They just thought it was really odd that we were playing a board game. Actually, they just didn't understand why people would want to play board game. But now I think 15 or so years on, people, they're board game cafes. And I think one of the reasons is because it's not just, obviously on video games, you can network people together. But I think when you're grown-ups and you can sit around a table and eat and drink and socialize, and if you can get a game that sparks conversation, that's really good. And we discovered this by making this sort of collective playing a Guy Debord's game. Is that some people will play the game, other people will talk about the game, other people would just flirt with each other or argue with each other. And I think that's one of the great things about a game, is it's a way of lefties creating a space. And if you think about like the Labour movement of 100 years ago, a lot of it was to create these alternative spaces which are not heavily commercialized by capital. And that's one of the things we're in the Mayday rooms at the moment in London, and that's this alternative space, and we're running a monthly event there. And again, it's that same thing, bringing people together who might not have the shared politics. I don't think I agree with Platypus about various things, but nonetheless, it's good to have them there to talk about your game. And he said with the with Labour people, we as I said, with the World Transformed, it was really good. We had no problem with them. It was interesting when we tried to persuade the Labour leadership to do basically future planning. What happens if you get elected and there's a run on the power. Actually, one thing I want to do is a game to try and force them to do military intervention abroad. I mean, it wouldn't be a problem with Starmer. We'd go anywhere the Americans ordered him to. But I thought it'd be really funny to try and get them to sort of, would they intervene to help the PKK, or something like that, something that we support. But it's those sorts of games, but they were really hostile to it. It was interesting. Not John McDonnell, who was the Shadow Chancellor I was doing work with, but the Labour leadership team, in what's called Lotto, the leader of the opposition. They were very suspicious because again they thought it was a hostage to fortune. And soon John said, "Oh, we're going to have a game to work out what we do and run on the pound." They completely freaked out. They just said, "You can't do that. You can't talk about that." But because it was going to happen, it would happen. So why wouldn't you do the military would do that, or businesses would do that? But it's interesting that the left doesn't quite get it in the same way. And we need to do that. I mean, it can lead to bad decisions. There's a friend of ours, mine and Brian, called Tom, he works for the Cranfield Defence Academy, and in 2014 they were playing a game at Connections UK, which is like a professional war gamers conference at King's College London, and it was called Bandera, and it was NATO versus Russia in Ukraine. And they were actually preparing for the war that we go, this horrendous tragedy that's going on there. And it was noticeable how little they knew about what they were doing. They didn't know anything about the politics of the area, the people who were playing the game. I mean, the game is interesting just to see what they were conceiving of.
And for you, Joe, how do you feel the perception is in maybe more on maybe more on the ground? You're pretty involved in local associations and movement around housing. Like, is this even a topic?
So I guess in the groups I'm in, there tend to be quite a few younger people who maybe have played at least something like Catan or some other games like this before. So are aware of modern board games as a thing. So don't just think, oh, that'll be like Risk or something. And I have had a few people say, oh, maybe you could come up with a game for us to play for this training thing or something. And I don't think they quite conceive of the complexity of some of the games I work on for GMT, for instance. So I would need to think carefully about what a game for that kind of thing looks like. But there's certainly not a dismissal of it, and there's an awareness of that games could be something slightly more serious and a tool for something. And I've given some thought to working on maybe a game about housing in Glasgow, as a kind of training exercise or a team building exercise or just kind of socializing thing. So yeah, that's something I've thought about and I might try to do. And it'd be good to talk to you, Richard, about your experience doing that kind of thing.
We had discussions with people who wanted to do like local training games. So I think that's actually really. Well, I think that's a really interesting thing. And again, you get less that pushback. The only problem is they don't have the money to give you the time to be able.
Absolutely, yeah. I would need to be. I'm already doing plenty of basically volunteer stuff, so it would have to be that kind of work for that. So that's something I might do.
Yeah, we did a Matrix game for Nesta, which is this sort of new Labour foundation, and that was really good. I mean, it wasn't a huge amount of money, but it gave us enough time to actually do it, and we did it for like a local government conference where it was about getting people to, the good thing about Matrix games, you have to discuss things, so it was getting them to discuss various options of what you can do, and they're sort of NGOs and local government bureaucrats and politicians and activists. And I thought that was a really interesting. We just sort of had a sort of abstract board, and it was getting to discuss, whether you want a recycling or a community development,
exactly,
whatever, and I think that's a really useful way of, again, we've been talking about. I think it's interesting. Everyone's been talking about this. We're working with people of lots of different political tendencies, and the left only is strong if we are a united army and we spend more time cooperating with each other and fighting the enemy rather than fighting each other. And games can be a way of actually helping us to understand how to do that,
and maybe a way of blowing off some steam. Maybe playing out some of these disagreements in games might be a useful way to air that actually. So as a way, a kind of safe way to explore some of these differences in strategy. So people can try different kinds of strategies and have some fun, seeing what works and what doesn't work, and it's very low stakes. Even if some people get a little overexcited about games sometimes.
Well, that is true.
Yeah,
I was really peeved to lose as the Paris Commune thing.
I was really disappointed in you, Richard. I was really putting all my hopes in you, and you actually you betrayed the revolution in a way. But
I know.
That's a trial for another day. Yeah,
we'll just have to make sure Robin Hood wins the Maoist group.
Yeah, please do. I would be very sad if not.
The Norman yoke.
And for you, Yoni, so I think we already started talking about two things. First, the perception in our political spaces, but also the ways in which they could be used. So we talked about social lubricants for get people together, maybe a space for militants that have different views to discuss different viewpoints. What's your perspective on this? How do you see the perception of games and how they can be used?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's sort of in the larger context of what is a cultural artifact, right? And how does it exist in society? And I've always viewed culture and games as being sort of downstream from a political situation, meaning that the political conditions and material conditions create the games, not the other way around. However, I also, what Joe said also resonates a lot with me too. It's through these spaces of play, right? They don't have to be necessarily useful, right? They're not. They don't have to be conceived of as productive spaces. They could be spaces of play and spaces of thought and rumination and shared problem solving, right? And I think that creates conditions for reflection and for revealing the way the systems work, the way that ideologies work, and I think that's that's immensely important, right? It's exactly in those spaces where you're allowed to play, where you're allowed to be something that you're not, that you get to see kind of like you get some insight on how things work. And yeah, that's it for me. I mean, I don't have a lot of crossover between the like any sort of like like political group and game groups. My game groups tend to be very sort of diverse in terms of political tendencies, and they're always like really interesting. I find that like playing John Company, for example, with somebody who doesn't actually understand that they're occupying the role of villains, historical villains, is fascinating and frustrating, and also like leads to like really great conversations. So yeah.
And for you, Alex, so what's your point of view on the perception of gaming in political spaces, but also on the way they can be used?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I'm not sure exactly what the perception is. I think maybe Richard said that board games are having an explosion of popularity, and so people are playing board games whether they're in movements or not. And obviously, it's better if we can create games that represent topics that are relevant to organizing or relevant to radical history as something probably more just relevant to play rather than just whatever else is coming out in the board game hobby. I had an interesting experience though where recently I through a labor union, I was essentially contracted to create a card game about organizing your workplace to go on strike. And so I think, and I have had other experiences where labor seems a little bit more attentive to maybe board games or the possibilities therein, where maybe it's just a vehicle to have something to get their members together for social events. But I ended up creating this very simple card game. It hasn't been published yet, but it's sort of rooted in the experience of the Amazon labor union. And I happen to know some organizers here in Philadelphia who are involved in Amazon labor union. And I was able to bring my prototype to them and say, hey, what do you guys think about this game about organizing your workers? And they were full of ideas of how, well, you didn't show this, you didn't show that, and where's this, where's that? And that made it, a much, much better game because it was rooted in their actual experience of organizing. So I think, people are aware that that games have some potential to allow this collective strategizing, because it is that kind of a tool for people to get together and face-to-face explore, discuss, and have that experience, where video games don't really have that potential. It's just a question of creating games that actually speak to those topics and have some relevance to organizing that people can grab onto and hopefully bring it to their organizations, to their labor unions, or whatever it is.
Great. I just want to give a couple of shout outs because there are some new people joining the stream, and I'm pretty happy about this. First of all, there is Yeast Games. So if you don't know Yeast Games, they are a French publisher that recently did a game, Which Side Are You On? About organizing yourselves as workers in New York in the, I think, early 19th, late 18th century. A very interesting worker placement game that shows the realities of being a worker at that time. Very, very interesting thing. Design. I really enjoyed that game. If you're interested, there is a teach and play video on the channel, but it's in French, so you'll have to learn French to appreciate it. But the game is also in English, and I really recommend that you go and watch it or just have a look for the game. Super, super interesting topic. And we also have Edward from Heavy Cardboard, who is here. Very happy to have you on the stream, and I hope to have you on the channel at some point because we talked about the collab, and I would really like to do that. Probably the best way to learn heavy strategy games on YouTube. Heavy Cardboard. Awesome channel. I have a question here from Ian that's, I think, really interesting and resonates with what we've been discussing about how we can use games in political spaces. Ian is asking, are they just relevant, or can we actually practice and test tactics in the same way as a war game? So can they be actually tools for social movements to prepare themselves? And I think that, Richard, you probably have a long answer that is actually detailed with experience. But I'm wondering if someone wants to jump in before I leave this one to Richard, that I guess is probably maybe the most equipped to answer that question. Any of you had some sort of experience around that? Not really. But then
no
Richard,
practical experience.
yeah, Richard.
Yeah.
So I would be curious to have your point of view on this one.
Well, I think it's interesting about Guy Debord's game is it was made after the May '68, where he was sort of told if he didn't leave Paris, they would kill him by the secret police. And so he went to Auvergne, and him and Alice Becker made this game. And it's interesting. One of the revealing things is where he says it's my most important achievement. So if you get the academics of historical materialism, of course they're not in. That doesn't get them because it's not a book, footnote or something, or a film or something like that. And why is that the case? And I think that because he also in Champs Libres published a new translation of Karl von Clausewitz's On War, and actually republished his military campaign analysis, which I highly recommend. And I think what he was trying to do is to get the left to think tactically and strategically, because one of the problems is that, and again, it's something where everybody's been bringing up, is that we tend to, the left tends to have a very moralistic view of politics. I mean, for lots of very good historical reasons. And, one of the advantages of looking at this gruesome thing called warfare is you have to be brutally real. You can't be moralizing about it, because otherwise you'll lose. And I think that's one of the things he was saying. And he said, we lost in May '68. We didn't cause the workers' councils didn't take over and overthrow the Cinquième République. But so the only way to
one day, Richard, we'll get to the sixth one. Yeah.
When Jean-Luc becomes president.
Yes, soon, very soon.
So I think one of the things he thought that, if we're not going to if we're going to get rid of the general, de Gaulle, we need to replace it with a collective general. And the way we do that is to get everybody knowing the tactics. And so his view was that this game was a way of teaching. And I think we can learn from that lesson, even if we don't necessarily still situationists, even though I'm still very influenced by it. I think so. One of the things we were trying to do when we did like these role-playing games was actually, I said, getting people to think about how their opponents are playing. And this is one thing I think we really did learn from Debord. It's interesting. He made a Napoleonic game. Why did he make a horse and musket game? Why did he make a May '68 game or a 1917 game? Because he was interested in getting us. It's not so much the game, the period. It's actually how you think about economy of forces, concentration of power forces, and outflanking the enemy, all these sorts of ideas which you can get out of Clausewitz and then applying them to our sort of politics. And he said, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a war game. Brian Drain is in the chat. One of our favourite games we used to play quite a lot of was Red Guard, which is his Cultural Revolution game, which is, again, you have different factions in the Cultural Revolution with different attributes and play against each other. And it's a very social game. One of our friends who wasn't really into playing games, that she won it because everyone else was so busy attacking each other that she just suddenly at the end of the game turned out that she actually controlled most of the party and the state. So again, I think those sorts of games are quite interesting lesson for people to learn of. And then again, of course, there's just games as propaganda. So CorbynRun, this app game.
Yeah,
that was part of, everyone knows this now, but the Labour bureaucracy, who would later installed Starmer as the leader, they were trying to lose the 2017 election. So there was like a provisional campaign, and we were part of it. We were just one of a number of websites and memes and the mass meetings and the canvassing, and we just happened to be there at the right time with this game, which was a rip-off actually of Fiscal Combat from Jean-Luc Mélenchon's campaign. His was Jean-Luc went and beat up people to get the money off them.
Yeah.
So we thought that was a bit macho. Very Jean-Luc, but not very Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, very Jean-Luc.
We did a sort of 8-bit, 16-bit race game instead, and it was very much a homage. And that was amazing. So I realised it because I went to Carnival. These friends of mine have a sound system there, which I go to every. And there was this person who I've known since he was a small kid, but he must have been then about 20, I would have thought. And he said, "Oh, Richard, what have you been doing?" And I said, "Oh, blah, blah, blah." And we made this app game. And he got out his mobile and said, "Is it this one?" And I went, "Right, that's it. We have been successful. You have got out of the leftist ghetto." And it's turned into something that is just shared among people because it's a fun game. And it's telling people about the Labour manifesto, and it's encouraging them to go out and vote. And it's just part of this whole general movement. I mean, it was an incredible moment in English history. I don't think the British ruling class has ever quite recovered from it. And you can only understand everything that's happened in Britain since then as a reaction to that horrible moment when they got within 100,000 votes of Jeremy being Prime Minister.
We have a few questions from the chat, and I think I will ask them to each of you. And I think the first question that I want to take is from Rodrigo, who's also Mutaka on the Homo Ludens Discord server. And I think probably I would like you to answer this one, Joe, because I think that all the work that you do on the Coin series is actually makes you really equipped to actually answer this question. And the question is, how do you think contemporary social movements are best depicted in game design? Factions with its necessary amalgamation of ideas, or cards, or even both?
I think, I mean, this is a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think really it depends on the social movement and the particular game you're making. And I think in a lot of ways we don't really have the answers yet. So I kind of hinted earlier that I think the coin system can be appealing to play around with, but lots of stuff gets forced into it that doesn't really fit so well. I mean, kind of like Rodrigo hinted at there, at that scale, you end up muddling up lots of smaller groups often into one faction, which can be fine for certain kinds of games, but it doesn't really do justice to lots of the complexities, and in particular the complexities which I think several of us have already discussed here about trying to work in coalition, which is hard, and that's a big part of what we all end up having to do. So probably my answer would be that to do justice to a lot of contemporary social movements, you're going to have to zoom in a lot and go to a lot finer kind of grain of scale and look at quite small kind of campaigns or occurrences and look at the coalition building within these, and maybe draw on some of Alex's ideas about co-op and semi-co-op kind of games and those dynamics, which Richard mentioned earlier as well. What that's more about the kind of games you might make, what kinds of mechanics you use. That's almost less important in a way, I think. You could use a card-driven game, kind of like Yoni is doing, or like Alex has done, or you could do something with drawbags, which again Alex has done. I now realize in the same game. There's lots of different ways you can
Alex
do
has
this.
Alex has done everything.
That's all in just one game, even.
Yeah, he's covered all of all the ground.
He's used all possible mechanisms. But yeah, I mean that's just to say really that I think you need to be more particular about it, and you need to go in with a very intentional idea of the kind of game you want to make and the kinds of dynamics you want to model. And with social movements, I think particularly the kinds of social dynamics you want to model, whether that's internally or whether that's externally, because a lot of the aims and objectives we have with these movements aren't kinetic, they aren't directly material. Sometimes there are cases where a movement might be trying to take over a building or fight some cops or something that really less interesting in some ways. And I think it's that more it's kind of more ephemeral process of trying to make these different social coalitions work and trying to persuade people of things. And I'm not sure we necessarily have very sophisticated game mechanisms for dealing with those yet. So that's something I'd be very interested and excited to see grow and to work with people on.
Super interesting.
And it really depends on the historical period too, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
what are the power dynamics? What kind of repression is going on? Is the social movement working on an institutional level, on an individual level, on an anti-institutional level? You know, these are all sort of contextualized with history, which, you know, obviously should, you know, be determined. So at least the mechanics should be reflective of that.
And Yoni, I have a
Yeah.
question for you here from
For sure.
Molotov Cockatiel, who's asking any current events you would like to see represented in board games. So he was wondering about the recent college protest and police response. That could be interesting. But are there any topics that you would like to see covered looking at current events?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Chicago '68 is doing this, right? It's addressing the moment, the present moment through a historical lens, right? For me, I can't work in the contemporary context without, you know, some sort of like historical understanding, and I think historical understanding takes time, takes years, maybe decades. But there are certain people who are, you know, making reactive, interesting games that are modeling like the current situation. Yeah, somebody in the chat mentioned Jim Dunnigan's Up Against the Wall, Motherfucker, about the 1968 Columbia occupation, and seeing that. I actually, there's a conversation I'm having with activists who are working around the Democratic National Convention in the summer in 2024. And they're actually talking about that specific game and seeing if there's a way to kind of recontextualize it, update it for now. So there are these conversations are definitely happening.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe one question that I will put out for you, Alex. Another question from Rodrigo here, asking how to depict multicultural societies we have on larger groups without erasing minorities.
Well, it's a great question. I don't know that you can. I mean, you can't depict everything, obviously. The more complexity you want to show in terms of the granularity of different micro groups and cultures and everything, the more complex of a game you're making. So, unfortunately, I don't know that there's a great answer for that. At least I don't have one. Part of the thing about board games is you need the players to essentially internalize the mechanisms and all the rules and run it themselves. So it doesn't work the same as a video game, which can get, you know, extremely, can get into millions of calculations every second. So just from a scale point of view, you need to, you know, make concessions when you're creating a model of history or current events or whatever it is. You have to generalize, and unfortunately, a lot of things are going to get lost in the wash. But you know, you can certainly make specific cards for specific, you know, important things, but you're not going. There's no possible way to cover everything, because even within the smallest, you know, politically aligned affinity group, there's going to be a wide range of opinions, and that's just reality. So we're not going to be like, for me, my games are not about simulating reality or simulating history. That's impossible. It's more about creating a fun game that hopefully can inspire people to go out and either perform social change or at least imagine it. And you have to leave some things behind.
And another couple of questions. The first one, and that will depend on who played GMT's Prime Minister. But yeah, it's basically a question: do recent games like GMT's Prime Minister start to deal with topics like influence and favor, even at a basic level? So personally, I played it. I have strong opinions about, not strong opinions, but I have opinions about GMT's Prime Minister. I don't know if anyone else here on the panel has played it. No. Joe, you haven't played it?
I played it in some stages of development. Yeah, I'm not sure I played the panel game.
Okay, yeah, I would say what I think about it, and then I would be curious to have your point of view on this one, Joe. The first thing is that I actually quite enjoyed the game. I think it's an interesting game about the specificities of parliamentary politics, especially in the UK at that specific period. I think it's a lot more interesting than what it looks like, because you look at it, it's a lot of tracks on different groups of people in British society and how you can influence them in different way. And there is a clever election mechanic, and you have that whole dynamic between the front bench, back bench, and all this. And I think it's really interesting to depict that and to illustrate this. And I enjoyed the game, and I'm considering making a review of it, and I would say that I'm pretty positive about it. My main issue that I have with it, within the context of this specific discussion that we have now, is that I don't feel like it engaged seriously with politics, in the sense that the way it shows politics is a very liberal way of looking at politics, which is politics as a spectacle. Nothing has consequences. No social groups are having actual influence on whether, for example, the Conservative Party is pushing. Like, it doesn't take into account that much that when you do something for landowners, actually you have landowners in your party, for example. So it is a bit disconnected, and it feels a bit weird in that sense. And I felt the same way when I was playing Hegemony, where I felt a really strong disconnect around how politics actually work and the way it is depicted in the game. It is really interesting. It shows interesting things, but I don't think that it says anything really interesting about politics as a as a struggle and what you're doing. And the fact that politics have no consequences is also something that's stuck with me, because I think that conceptually, mechanically, you could implement that. For example, in the game, you can take decisions on Ireland, for example, or the rest of the empire, so the colonies that are further. But whatever you do has no long-term consequences. You just do something, you answer a question to the parliament, and you take a decision, and something moves up or down the track, and you're like, what are the consequences of this? There must be consequences, and it's really weird. But what was your perspective, Joe?
So I've two things to add to that. I don't disagree with any of that. You probably like the game more than me. I think it's not really my kind of game. I mean, it is at its heart really just a kind of dials go up and down kind of game. So it's quite kind of crunchy like that, I guess. I think what you were saying is interesting though, and it reminds me a bit of some feelings I have about Versailles 1919. And I think both in a way might end up, whether intentionally or not, making a kind of meta statement in an interesting way, where the actors, the players or represent are quite alienated from the decisions they're making. So in both cases, you feel quite distant from it, and you're really just making kind of micro mechanical choices about what the most efficient thing to do. And that might be not so far off how the decision makers in Versailles felt, or even how 19th century UK politicians feel, because none of these decisions they're making really have much consequence for them outside of their own political career. So I mean, that, whether intentional or not, that's maybe one interesting aspect of those games. But yeah, what you're saying rings true to me, and there's not enough of the kind of complex dynamics where what you're doing has an impact on future things there. You're just kind of lobbying these completely inert factions like the landowners or the workers or so on. And there's also no agency for anyone other than two or three politicians in Westminster in making these choices or having any kind of political role, which goes back to something Alex said as well. You can't capture everything in one game. So this game focuses in particular on a few very high level politicians and the kinds of things they do. The kinds of things they do are just go and talk to the Queen, go and give a speech somewhere, and that's the kind of things which you do in the game. So in that sense, it does what it sets out to achieve, but it doesn't capture politics in a wider sense, perhaps, which you might want to have in it.
In a way, I would see it as anti-materialistic. I think that's the problem that I have with it. And I think it's not a left or right thing. I think being materialistic when you look about politics is about being reasonable. so that's the thing. And I don't think it does that in any meaningful way. So that's my main issue with that. And I have one last question, and this one is just for you, Richard, because I think it's you're the only one with extensive experience on that topic, and I think it would be really interesting to hear your perspective on this. And that's a question from Ian, who's asking, how do you educate a metrics game around social movements? So more on the practical side, how can you use metrics game to talk about this, and what are the outcomes you should be looking for, and how to structure those?
I think the interesting thing about the Matrix game is the discussion that between the players. So I mean, the adjudication, is done by throwing dice, basically. I have this from Tom. He's got this nice little distribution curve diagram we used, and I think that you give point as the games master, you give points to all the arguments, and then people can, even if they don't do a very good argument, they can win if their dice throw is good, or vice versa if their dice throws a good argument and their dice throw is bad. So I think that's one of the. But I think it's a way, in a sense, Matrix games. It's not really a game; it's a way of facilitating discussions. And when we did it for Nesta, as I said, it was mainly for sort of local government, bureaucrats, activists, politicians, NGOs, that sort of people. And they don't really play board games. They're the sort of most non-board gaming audience you could have. But they all loved it. It was absolutely rammed, the session, partly because they'd just been watching PowerPoint presentations all day. And I think that was one of the interesting things about it is that it allowed them to actually have a proper discussion, and they got to meet each other. And again, lots of things that everybody I think has been saying about the social aspect of board games, and I think that works really well. But I think as a games master, you have to be really careful on this, that it's not about winning and losing. I mean, some people do technically win.
And just maybe
I think especially that sort of thing when it's a non-military, non-geopolitical game. I think it's in a way what you're trying to do is make sure everyone feels included, everybody wins a little. It's a bit like in Alice in Wonderland, the caucus race, where everybody gets prizes. And I think that's one of the powers of Matrix games that you can allow to do that. We did try thinking about trying to do one because Tom does these ones with flashcards where people can vote on the argument. But I played this other game with him last year, which scarily was called One China, which is basically about NATO versus China. Having failed to beat Russia, they're now going to go on and fight an even more powerful enemy. But that was interesting because the flashcards don't really work because people tend to vote for their side. So even if things...
they get caught up in the game mechanics more.
It only works if people are able to actually think rationally or realistically about an argument rather than doing their team, and I think that's part of the problem. If it becomes a competitive game, it would only really work if they're like the audience in a Greek play.
But I've heard about
the chorus. I was thinking you need the chorus who give you positive. But the game's not about to do that. I think it's about inclusion. So it's a sort of very different sort of game. You can use it, obviously. Tom's using it for military training, and as I said, these geopolitical games where they're leading the West into decisive defeats, I think are really interesting. But I don't think that's for social movements. I think we have to use them in a completely different way. And originally they weren't designed for military purposes. They were actually designed for social movements. And I think that's one of the things, is to bring them back to that sort of more cooperative community basis. And that's where I think they're really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And there was a question from Molotov Kokatiel asking, what is a Matrix game? Because we were talking about it, but we weren't really mentioning what it was. And Brian kindly jumped in and explained that it was invented by Chris Engel. And it is, as you said, for what we get from your answer, a moderated, structured, interactive argument with more or less game mechanic. And it's pretty open. It feels a bit like a role-playing game in a lot of ways.
It's like a role-playing game without having to write really big scripts for people.
Yeah, exactly.
The two for World Transform, we one thing we learned out is to heavily script it. Actually, if you give people got a piece of paper and it says this is what you're supposed to do to win, and this is what will happen if you do, you'll lose. Then they each will play the role. But Matrix games don't do that. It's in the sense the game master has to direct people, or you have little tracks that they want to move up and down. It's got a much easier point of entry. I mean, I said when we were doing the World Transform, these were Labour lefties, so they knew, what the internal mechanisms of the Conservative Labour Party were, or local council.
And there is also a movement of game designers. I think about Volko, but also others. I think Steven is also doing that. Steven Ranganzas, about using actual board games, but using them as a template or a core structure to animate a metrics game around them. I don't know if you know more about this, Joe, because I've talked about Volko about the fact that he's using his coin games, but in a facilitated way to articulate and structure discussion. What do you think about this, Joe?
So it's something me and Stephen and our friend MB have talked about quite a bit. Stephen's run Flavies for us and has some ideas for others. And basically, so it's a little bit like a hybrid between a Matrix game and a kind of commercial board game. So, he'd be taking a commercial board game on an interesting topic, but then using that as a framework to run something more like a Matrix game. So he actually ran Freedom in the Galaxy for us, which is a very old kind of Star Wars knockoff game that's got some interesting ideas about early insurgency, which is a topic he's interested in.
By John Butterfield, importantly.
Exactly. The problem is that the government player as such can be very dull to play, and the game can be very slow and quite tedious, as a lot of these old games are for like quite a long time. It's just an old, very big, very long game. But Stephen's idea was to run running the government himself and almost GMing it there for the rest of us who were cooperating as small insurgent cells, and kind of building up in this way. So that's it's not quite a Matrix game because we were still using most of the resolution mechanics of the game, but he's there to interject as the GM and change things or shift things and kind of move things around a bit. We've had some discussions about how to use other games for a similar kind of thing.
And I hope that we'll have Stephen to actually maybe demo a session of his approach to this game, the John Butterfield game, on the channel. So I'll provide some updates. One last comment, Richard?
Yeah, I think the point about it is that you don't need to know any rules. I think that's the power of Matrix games. You just have to say, well, I'm doing this, and then you make an argument from your knowledge of whatever the situation is, whether it's in local government or the politics of the South China Seas.
Yeah, it's a lower point of entry. Like it's easier to get people in.
I think the advantage. Someone was saying, about how do you, get people like in trade unions or community groups into gaming. They might, because some of the people obviously in those groups will have played board games. Others will have not played them since their childhood. And Matrix games, I think, are a nice way of in between. So really the point of it is not winning or losing or having, some of the other things we talk about. It's just to get at people to discuss. And again, it's the thing, we've all been talking about the same thing. We got the left to be successful has to bring together people with very different viewpoints. And Matrix games are quite a good way of doing that, I think, because it allows lots of people to have different arguments, and it actually makes people argue. I mean, I've taught in universities, and one of the key problems is that people who don't talk in seminars. I mean, I've had students say, "You're the first person I've ever talked to in a seminar," because I just used to go around and point at them and say, "What do you think?" And I think one of the good things about Matrix games is they make everybody forced to express themselves, they feel shy, but the mechanism of the game gives them a space where they are allowed to express their opinion. I mean, they might still lose, but at least had a say. And I think that's one of the positive things about it. The low barrier to entry and the fact everybody gets to participate. And in one sense, it's not really a winning and losing game. And I think those are all bits which, if we're thinking of using games as a politically organizing tool, which is one of, I assume, the themes of today, I think they are useful, but you have to have games masters who.
I mean, they're really very close to just rules-light role-playing games. Really, just that players are often in charge of an organization or a group rather than just a single character.
Yeah, and you don't have to read lots of script or rules. And I think that's a good thing about them. And in that sense, they're like team building exercises companies run or whatever. And I think it's as embarrassing as company team building exercise.
I think it's interesting because that's a concept that I was thinking about when I was thinking about games footprint, and I did a détournement of Bourdieu's cultural capital, and I was talking about the ludic cultural capital and the problem that there was variable barrier of entry when you come to gaming, depending on the kind of experience that you have with game. And we know, for example, in social studies in France, that it's more of a middle class occupation. And if you're working class, you probably never played board game or just played Uno or basic card games. And even upper class, they don't tend to, they go to art exhibits and stuff like this, but they don't play board games at home. So there is a wide variety of experiences with the game. And when you want to bring a wide variety of people in, I think Matrix games are really good because it levels down the playing field, and everyone with different ludic cultural capital can come in and enjoy the experience in the same way. But I think those were very exciting discussion. Thanks for all of you for being here tonight to celebrate May Day and talk about game design. And I would like to say, workers of the world, unite and play board games.
Yeah, exactly.
I have one final question for Fred, which I've been dying to ask ever since he did his little commercial shout out at the start. Fred, how do you feel about enclosing the Commons, which is Homo Ludens Discord server, in this way? Taking this natural commodity, an online community, and
I would say this, Joe. I don't see access to the server as a commodity, but the fact that you think it is, that you think that the server is so good that is actually linked to your happiness and
labor value.
That it has actually value for you in your eyes means a lot. And you don't do a lot of compliments, but the fact that you're so upset that you have to pay to join the Discord server makes me really happy. But yeah, thanks everyone for.
Party dues are being now collected, are they?
Yeah. You have to. Yeah. I'm paying to the party every month. You know, it's like, and I'm not complaining about it. That's just the thing that you have to do. But thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the chat who had super interesting question and was very engaged. It was really nice to also have you, Kabuki Kid, being here and making the chat very lively. And it was awesome to have Brian Train always here answering question and interjecting with really interesting comments. Thanks to all of you. Happy May Day. And yeah, see you soon.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Forward to communism.